Afghanistan, a land of soaring mountains, arid deserts, and winding rivers, has long been a crossroads of empires. By the late 1970s, it was a nation struggling to balance tradition and modernity, tribal autonomy and central authority. The country's population, composed of Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and other ethnic groups, lived under a complex patchwork of social and cultural norms. Rural villages adhered to centuries-old codes of behavior, with tribal elders and religious leaders wielding influence over daily life, while cities like Kabul began to experience the stirrings of modern governance, education, and industry. Afghan society was deeply hierarchical. Land ownership and kinship determined social standing, while gender norms shaped every aspect of life. Women's roles were largely confined to home and family, although the cities provided new opportunities for education and professional work. Schools, universities, and media outlets were concentrated in urban centers, but much of the countryside remained isolated, with limited access to government services or health care. These disparities fostered a sense of disconnect between the urban elite and rural populations, a rift that would later influence the country's response to revolutionary changes and foreign intervention. Afghanistan's economy in the 1970s was fragile. Agriculture employed the majority of the population, but it was subject to unpredictable rainfall, outdated farming methods, and limited irrigation. Small-scale trade and local markets connected villages to towns, yet infrastructure was underdeveloped, making communication and transportation slow and unreliable. Kabul and a few provincial towns began to see industrial growth, funded by foreign aid and development projects, but the benefits were unevenly distributed. These economic challenges created tensions, particularly as a young population looked for opportunities that traditional social structures could not provide. By 1978, Afghanistan was politically volatile. The monarchy had been overthrown just 3 years prior, and the country was ruled by a fragile republic struggling to implement reforms. Amidst this turbulence, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, emerged as a powerful force. The PDPA, a Marxist-Leninist party, was split between two factions: Khalq, a more radical group advocating rapid reforms, and Parcham, which supported gradual change and alignment with Soviet policies. Both factions sought to modernize Afghanistan, but their vision clashed with the deeply rooted traditions of Afghan society. The PDPA came to power through the Saur Revolution of April 1978, overthrowing President Daud Khan in a swift coup. The new government promised equality, land reform, and social modernization, aiming to transform Afghanistan into a socialist state. Yet the reforms were imposed aggressively, often without regard for local customs. Land redistribution angered tribal leaders. Efforts to reduce the influence of religious authorities provoked widespread resentment. Literacy campaigns and women's emancipation initiatives, while progressive in theory, were met with suspicion and resistance in rural areas. Khalq's consolidation of power was ruthless. Purges of political opponents, executions of former officials, and suppression of dissent became commonplace. Parcham members, once allied with Khalq, were marginalized or imprisoned. The population grew fearful, and rebellion began to simmer across the countryside. The government's attempts at modernization, though ambitious, were poorly executed, lacking the local understanding necessary to navigate Afghans' tribal and religious landscape. The countryside, home to the majority of Afghans, reacted strongly against the PDPA's reforms. Tribal elders, religious leaders, and village communities viewed the government's policies as a direct threat to their autonomy and way of life. A network of resistance began to emerge, fueled by anger at forced collectivization, the banning of certain cultural practices, and the perceived insult to Islam. Reports of protests, village uprisings, and violent clashes with government forces became increasingly common. By late 1978, small-scale rebellions had spread from provinces like Herat, Kandahar, and Nangarhar. These uprisings were diverse, Some were motivated by religious conviction, others by loyalty to tribal leaders, and still others by economic grievances. The government responded with military force, further alienating the population. Helicopters and armored vehicles were deployed to quell insurgencies, while the Stasi-like intelligence apparatus monitored dissenters in urban centers. Fear and resentment multiplied, creating an environment of instability and uncertainty. Afghanistan's political turmoil did not exist in isolation. It became a focal point for Cold War dynamics. The Soviet Union, sharing a long border with Afghanistan, viewed the PDPA as a potential ally and buffer state. Moscow was deeply concerned that instability in Kabul could destabilize the broader region, threaten socialist influence, and invite Western intervention. In contrast, the United States and Pakistan closely monitored developments, wary of Soviet expansion and eager to maintain influence in South Asia. Moscow initially provided economic aid, military advisors, and technical assistance to strengthen the PDPA. Yet the Soviets grew frustrated with the Kalk government's inability to stabilize the country. Reports of violent uprisings, government purges, and political incompetence alarmed Soviet officials. By 1979, the stage was set for a dramatic intervention as Afghanistan teetered between revolutionary ambition and societal collapse. In Kabul and other urban centers, life continued amidst growing tension. Citizens navigated a complex world of propaganda, fear, and subtle resistance. Government slogans adorned walls and schools, emphasizing loyalty to the state, socialist ideals, and the promise of modernization. Yet in neighborhoods and cafes, whispers of dissent circulated. Families discussed the risk of government reprisals, while young people secretly listened to banned radio broadcasts or foreign music, glimpses of life beyond the borders of their controlled world. Everyday existence was precarious. Food shortages, bureaucratic ineptitude, and political purges affected urban families as much as rural villagers. Yet Afghans displayed resilience, finding ways to adapt through social networks, clandestine economic activity, and informal education. Even in the midst of political upheaval, ordinary people sought continuity, connection, and hope, planting the seeds of the human stories that would later define the era of conflict. By late 1979, the PDPA government was fragile. Kalk leaders, aware of the growing insurgency and internal factionalism, requested more direct support from Moscow. The Soviet Union, fearing the collapse of a friendly government on its southern border and the possibility of a broader geopolitical setback, began planning a military intervention. Tensions escalated, and Kabul became a city on edge. Streets were patrolled by armed forces, government checkpoints multiplied, and citizens grew increasingly uncertain about the future. Soviet planners viewed the Afghan conflict as an opportunity to assert influence, protect their interests, and contain instability. However, they underestimated the complexities of Afghan society, the strength of tribal networks, and the depth of resistance to foreign control. The stage was set for a confrontation that would last a decade, drawing in regional and global actors, shaping international politics, and inflicting profound human costs. Afghanistan, a land of rugged mountains and ancient cities, was about to become a theater of war unlike any the Soviet Union had faced. For ordinary Afghans, the years ahead would test resilience, courage, and survival as foreign armies clashed with local militias and ideology collided with centuries of tradition. The story of the Soviet invasion and the human experiences it unleashed was only beginning to unfold. It was a cold December night in 1979 when Soviet transport planes began crossing the Amu Darya River into Afghanistan. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of Soviet paratroopers landed at Kabul International Airport, while armored columns rolled across the northern border. The mission, officially known as Operation Storm 333, would change the course of Afghanistan and the Cold War forever. The invasion's immediate objective was clear: Eliminate Afghanistan's increasingly erratic leader, Hafizullah Amin, and install a more reliable, pro-Soviet government under Babrak Karmal. To Moscow, Amin had become a liability. His ruthless purges, internal repression, and suspected communication with the CIA had alarmed the Kremlin. Soviet intelligence operatives feared that if he remained in power, the Afghan revolution would collapse, opening the door for Western influence to seep into Moscow's southern flank. In the early hours of December 27, 1979, elite Soviet Spetsnaz units stormed the Taj Beg Palace, Amin's heavily guarded residence on a hill overlooking Kabul. The firefight was short but brutal. Amin's guards fought fiercely, but the outcome was inevitable. Within an hour, the Afghan president was dead. Poisoned or shot, accounts vary, and Soviet forces controlled the capital. Soviet tanks surrounded key installations, the Ministry of Defense, the national radio station, and the airport. By dawn, Moscow's message was clear. The Soviet Union now held Afghanistan in its grip. The world would soon awaken to the shock of the invasion, but for Afghans, it marked the beginning of a decade of occupation, resistance, and unimaginable suffering. In Moscow, Soviet officials framed the invasion as a fraternal duty, a mission to support a socialist ally under threat from counter-revolutionary forces and foreign interference. Propaganda described the operation as a stabilizing effort to protect Afghanistan from chaos and reactionary extremists. Yet behind this rhetoric lay anxiety. The Kremlin's aging leadership, led by Leonid Brezhnev, feared that Afghanistan's collapse could weaken Soviet influence in Central Asia and embolden the United States. Internationally, the reaction was swift and severe. The United States, still reeling from the Iranian Revolution earlier that year, saw the Soviet invasion as blatant expansionism, a direct challenge to the post-World War II balance of power. President Jimmy Carter condemned the action as an unprovoked aggression, marking a sharp deterioration in U.S.-Soviet relations. Within weeks, the United States imposed economic sanctions, boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and suspended the SALT II arms treaty negotiations. The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to demand the immediate withdrawal of Soviet troops. Most Western and Islamic nations supported the resolution, isolating the USSR diplomatically. The non-aligned movement, of which Afghanistan had once been a member, expressed alarm at the erosion of sovereignty. Meanwhile, China, still wary of Moscow after the Sino-Soviet split, denounced the invasion as imperialist aggression. But beyond diplomatic statements, Afghanistan's tragedy was just beginning. The war that Moscow believed would last a few months would soon turn into a bloody, grinding conflict, a Soviet Vietnam. In the weeks following the invasion, Kabul became a city under occupation. Soviet soldiers patrolled the streets, their armored vehicles rumbling through intersections once crowded with street vendors and schoolchildren. The red flags of the PDPA flew over government buildings, but real power now rested in the hands of Soviet commanders. For ordinary Afghans, daily life was transformed overnight. Curfews were imposed. Road checkpoints dotted the highways. Villagers traveling to the capital were questioned, searched, and often detained. The state media broadcast messages of friendship between the Afghan and Soviet peoples, yet few were convinced. Posters of Babrak Karmal, the Kremlin's newly installed leader, appeared on walls and government offices, portraying him as a savior who had restored stability. But behind the facade, Afghanistan simmered with anger. Religious leaders, the mullahs, condemned the invasion as an assault on Islam. Tribal leaders denounced it as a foreign occupation. Across villages and provinces, whispers of resistance spread. Young men began to flee into the mountains, taking up arms against what they saw as godless invaders. The seeds of the Mujahideen movement were taking root. The occupation brought both fear and defiance. Families hid sons from recruitment drives, mosques became centers of organization, and clandestine pamphlets circulated, urging unity against the foreign power. In rural areas, Soviet convoys became targets of ambushes and sabotage, marking the first sparks of what would become a nationwide insurgency. The Soviet Union had entered Afghanistan expecting a brief, controlled intervention. Instead, it faced a sprawling insurgency unlike any it had ever encountered.
The Mujahideen, meaning those who struggle in the path of God, were not a unified army, but a loose coalition of tribal militias, religious fighters, and nationalist groups. Their motivations varied. Some fought for Islam, others for independence, and still others for tribal honor. What united them was a common enemy, the Soviet presence. By 1980, resistance had spread across the country. In provinces like Kunar, Paktia, Herat, and Badakhshan, local commanders emerged as leaders of small, mobile units that struck Soviet convoys, sabotaged infrastructure, and disappeared into the rugged terrain. The mountains became their fortress, the villages their supply lines. Afghan knowledge of the land proved an enormous advantage against an enemy dependent on tanks and helicopters. From across the border in Pakistan, the resistance received lifelines of support. Millions of Afghan refugees poured into camps near Peshawar, where resistance groups found new recruits. It was here that the conflict began to draw in the world's powers. What began as a regional rebellion soon evolved into a global proxy war. The United States, Saudi Arabia, China, and Pakistan saw in Afghanistan an opportunity to weaken the Soviet Union without direct confrontation. Through a covert program known as Operation Cyclone, the CIA funneled money, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen, often through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI. At first, the aid was modest: rifles, ammunition, communication equipment. But as the war intensified, so did the support. Saudi Arabia matched U.S. funding dollar for dollar, motivated both by anti-communism and religious solidarity. China contributed light arms and training, while Egypt supplied Soviet-made weapons captured during earlier conflicts. Pakistan became the central hub, hosting resistance leaders, managing logistics, and shaping the political dynamics of the Afghan Jihad. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, escalated its own efforts. More than 80,000 troops were stationed in Afghanistan by mid-1980, rising to 115,000 at the war's peak. The Red Army deployed tanks, helicopter gunships, and air power, yet the rugged terrain and elusive enemy rendered conventional tactics ineffective. The Soviet military had not anticipated a guerrilla war fought in mountains and villages, where loyalty was fluid and victory impossible to define. The invasion unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe. Entire villages were destroyed during Soviet bombardments. Civilians were caught between government reprisals and Mujahideen ambushes. The countryside became a patchwork of scorched fields, ruined homes, and displaced families. By 1981, nearly 3 million Afghans had fled to Pakistan and Iran, creating one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. In hospitals, doctors treated endless streams of wounded farmers, children, and women burned by napalm or maimed by landmines. Soviet forces employed scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and wells to deny the Mujahideen food and shelter. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were often bombed without warning. Yet each act of violence deepened local resistance, turning civilians into fighters. In cities like Kabul, life remained under tight control. Surveillance, arrests, and disappearances became part of daily reality. The secret police, KAD, worked closely with the KGB to suppress dissent. Political prisoners filled jails, and rumors of torture and execution spread. For many Afghans, survival meant silence. The Soviet soldiers themselves suffered too.
Many were young conscripts from distant republics, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Siberia, who had little understanding of the land they occupied. They faced harsh terrain, guerrilla ambushes, and eroding morale. Letters home spoke of isolation, confusion, and a growing realization that this war could not be won. News of the invasion dominated global headlines. Western journalists, though often restricted, captured harrowing images of burning villages, Soviet convoys, and refugee columns stretching across barren landscapes. Afghanistan became the latest front line of the Cold War, symbolizing both the limits of Soviet power and the brutality of geopolitical rivalry. In Islamic countries, the invasion sparked outrage. Demonstrations erupted from Cairo to Jakarta, denouncing the atheist occupiers. The Afghan Jihad gained moral and financial support from across the Muslim world. Volunteers from Arab nations, among them a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, traveled to Pakistan to aid the resistance, establishing networks that would later shape global militancy for decades. The war, which the Soviet Union had framed as a brief intervention, was becoming an international crisis with deep ideological, religious, and political dimensions. Afghanistan was no longer just a country in conflict, it was a symbol of resistance against superpower domination. By the end of 1980, Afghanistan had changed irrevocably. The invasion had shattered the fragile balance between tradition and modernization. Entire generations were uprooted, education systems collapsed, agriculture declined, and cultural life disintegrated under the weight of war. The once bustling bazaars of Herat, Kandahar, and Jalalabad stood half-empty as traders fled or joined the resistance. Yet amidst the devastation, a fierce sense of identity emerged. Afghans, divided by tribe, language, and region, found common cause in defending their land. The Mujahideen, for all their internal rivalries, symbolized an enduring truth. Foreign armies could occupy Afghan soil, but never its spirit. The Soviet invasion was meant to secure the revolution. Instead, it ignited one. By 1981, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had entered a new and brutal phase. What Moscow had expected to be a swift operation had evolved into a grinding guerrilla war that defied conventional strategy. The Red Army held the cities, air bases, and highways, but the countryside belonged to the Mujahideen, Afghanistan's holy warriors. The term Mujahideen, meaning those who struggle in the path of God, carried deep emotional weight. To many Afghans, these men were not mere soldiers. They were guardians of faith, family, and freedom. Young farmers, students, and ex-soldiers, armed with aging rifles and boundless conviction, began to organize into militias. Their weapons were crude, their logistics fragile, yet their determination was unbreakable. The early years of the resistance were chaotic. Dozens of factions emerged, each led by charismatic figures drawn from Afghanistan's diverse ethnic landscape: Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras. From the mountains of Kunar to the deserts of Kandahar, these groups waged war on Soviet patrols, convoys, and outposts. What began as small-scale ambushes soon evolved into coordinated attacks on garrisons and supply lines. Despite limited coordination, a shared mission united them: to drive out the invaders and reclaim Afghanistan's sovereignty. In this crucible of fire and resistance, legends began to form. Stories of impossible bravery, of men who faced tanks with faith and homemade explosives, of commanders who led barefoot through snow and sand to strike and vanish again into the mountains. Across the border, in Pakistan, the war was transforming from a local rebellion into an international enterprise. Millions of Afghan refugees, men, women, and children, had fled across the Durand Line seeking shelter in sprawling camps near Peshawar and Quetta. These camps became more than humanitarian shelters. They became the lifeblood of the resistance. It was in Pakistan that the political structure of the Afghan Jihad began to take shape. Under the guidance of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), 7 major Afghan Mujahideen parties were officially recognized. Among them were figures who would become pivotal in the coming years: Gulbuddin Hekmatyar of Hezb-e Islami, Burhanuddin Rabbani of Jamiat-e-Islami, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, and Yunus Khalis. Each represented a different ideology, tribal connection, or regional base of power, and each competed fiercely for influence and foreign aid. The ISI acted as the broker, controlling the flow of weapons, funds, and intelligence from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other allies. Peshawar, once a quiet frontier city, transformed into the nerve center of the Afghan resistance. Hotels and safe houses became meeting points for diplomats, journalists, and spies. The war had become global, and Pakistan was its staging ground. Meanwhile, training camps were established along the frontier, where Afghan recruits learned guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, and how to use landmines and rocket-propelled grenades. Instructors, some former Pakistani soldiers and others foreign volunteers, taught the art of asymmetrical warfare. It was here that many Mujahideen received their first exposure to modern combat training and Western-made weapons. But Pakistan's role was not purely altruistic. The regime of General Zia-ul-Haq viewed the Afghan Jihad as a strategic opportunity to expand Pakistan's regional influence, counter Indian power, and align itself with the United States during a renewed period of Cold War tension. It was a calculated alliance of faith and politics, one that would shape the region's destiny for decades to come. At the heart of the expanding conflict lay Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. Under Presidents Jimmy Carter and later Ronald Reagan, the United States funneled billions of dollars into Afghanistan, not through direct involvement, but through the shadowy channels of Pakistan's ISI. The logic was simple. Afghanistan could become the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a prolonged quagmire that would drain Moscow's economy and morale. Washington's goal was not merely to help the Afghans, it was to bleed the Soviets dry. In the early years, U.S. support was limited to non-lethal aid and small arms, Enfield rifles, mortars, and ammunition. But as the conflict escalated, the scope widened dramatically. By 1983, the Mujahideen were receiving recoilless rifles, heavy machine guns, and anti-aircraft weapons. Crates of Chinese, Egyptian, and American arms crossed the border into Afghanistan under the watchful eyes of the ISI. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, matched every U.S. dollar spent, channeling funds through Islamic charities and private donors. The war, portrayed as a defense of Islam, drew contributions from across the Muslim world. The Arab volunteers, young men inspired by religious duty, began arriving in Pakistan to join or support the jihad. Among them was a tall, quiet Saudi construction heir, Osama bin Laden, who began organizing logistics and funding networks for Arab fighters. Few could have imagined that these efforts would later echo far beyond Afghanistan. As weapons flowed and alliances deepened, the Afghan war became the epicenter of a global ideological struggle: communism versus faith, dictatorship versus freedom, superpower versus insurgent. The lines blurred, and Afghanistan became the battlefield on which the Cold War's invisible hands played their deadliest game. The Soviet Union, faced with growing losses, shifted its strategy. By 1982, the Red Army launched a series of massive counter-offensives aimed at breaking the back of the resistance. Using helicopters, fighter jets, and heavy artillery, they targeted key strongholds in Panjshir Valley, Khost, and Nangarhar. The Panjshir offensives, led by the Soviet General Vasily Gavrilov, became infamous. The valley, commanded by the legendary Mujahideen leader Ahmed Shah Massoud, resisted repeated Soviet assaults. Time and again, the Red Army would enter with overwhelming force, only to find empty villages and hidden ambushes. When they withdrew, the resistance would return stronger than before. The Soviets resorted to air power as their most potent weapon. They bombed villages suspected of harboring insurgents, mined agricultural fields, and used napalm and cluster bombs indiscriminately. The goal was to sever the link between the Mujahideen and the civilian population. But instead of crushing resistance, it fueled it. Each destroyed village created new recruits. Each atrocity deepened the resolve of the Afghan people. Soviet brutality became the Mujahideen's greatest recruitment tool. Within the Red Army, morale began to falter. Soldiers, many barely 20 years old, faced an enemy they could not see and a cause they did not believe in. Reports of desertion, drug use, and psychological trauma spread through the ranks. Letters home told of unbearable conditions, mountain ambushes, unending fear, and comrades who never returned. By 1984, more than 30,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed or wounded. The war was no longer a secret burden. It was an open wound in the heart of the Soviet Empire.
The Mujahideen's greatest strength lay in their adaptability. They understood that they could never defeat the Soviet Union in conventional warfare, but they could outlast it. They moved through the mountains like ghosts, striking and retreating before the enemy could respond. Their logistics were simple: family ties, tribal loyalty, and faith. Supplies moved on donkeys and mules through ancient passes. Fighters carried only what they could bear: rifles, bread, and Qurans. Communication was primitive but effective, relying on messengers and coded signals. Every man knew the land better than any map could describe. In some provinces, Mujahideen controlled entire regions by night, enforcing their own administration, collecting taxes, and maintaining justice through Islamic courts. They were not merely rebels, they were becoming a parallel state. What sustained them most was belief. For the Afghan fighter, martyrdom was not defeat, it was victory. Soviet commanders could not understand such faith, nor could they break it. This clash of worldviews, between an atheist empire and a people who saw resistance as divine duty, turned the Afghan war into something far greater than a political conflict. It became a spiritual confrontation. By the mid-1980s, the human toll of the conflict was staggering. Entire generations of Afghans had grown up knowing only war. The refugee population exceeded 4 million, with families scattered across Pakistan and Iran. Within Afghanistan, famine loomed as fields were bombed or abandoned. Schools closed, hospitals overflowed, and cultural heritage sites crumbled under bombardment. Children became the silent victims. Many were orphaned, recruited as messengers or fighters. Landmines, millions of them, turned farmlands into death traps. Aid agencies described Afghanistan as one of the most dangerous places on earth. And yet resilience persisted. In refugee camps, makeshift schools taught children to read and write. Women organized relief networks, secretly educating girls in defiance of traditional norms. Poets, teachers, and artists in exile kept Afghan culture alive through verse and song, telling stories of home, exile, and hope. In Washington, the Afghan War had become a cause célèbre. President Reagan, a master of symbolic politics, described the Mujahideen as freedom fighters. He invited Afghan leaders to the White House, calling them the moral equivalents of America's founding fathers. The imagery was powerful: bearded warriors fanning in the Oval Office, symbols of defiance against tyranny. Television networks broadcast footage of Afghan resistance, framed as a battle of good and evil. For the American public, Afghanistan became a stage where democracy stood up to communism. Few understood the complexities on the ground: the tribal divisions, ideological rifts, or the growing influence of extremist elements. But for Washington, the narrative was clear. Every Soviet helicopter shot down in Afghanistan was a victory for freedom. By 1984, U.S. aid had reached hundreds of millions of dollars annually. New weapons, anti-aircraft guns, and soon the game-changing Stinger missiles were being discussed. The tide of war was beginning to turn. By the end of 1984, Afghanistan stood at a crossroads. The Soviet army held the major cities, Kabul, Kandahar, and Jalalabad, but they were isolated islands in a sea of resistance. Beyond the barbed wire and checkpoints, the countryside was under Mujahideen influence. The Afghan government of Babra Karmal survived only through Soviet protection.
its authority limited to propaganda and bureaucracy. For the Soviet Union, the cost was mounting, financially, politically, and morally. What had begun as an assertion of control had become a war of attrition. Inside the Kremlin, doubts began to surface. Could Afghanistan be pacified? Or had Moscow stumbled into the same kind of endless quagmire that had destroyed other empires before it? For the Afghan people, the dream of liberation remained both near and impossibly distant. The war had united and divided them, empowered and exhausted them, but through it all, one truth remained unchanged. They would not surrender. The 1980s were still young, but the war in Afghanistan had already redrawn the map of global politics. The superpowers were locked in a deadly embrace, and Afghanistan, a land of poets, warriors, and shepherds, had become the battleground of ideologies. What neither side could yet foresee was that the fires lit in these mountains would burn far beyond the decade, reshaping the world in ways no one could imagine. By 1985, the Soviet war in Afghanistan had entered its fifth year. What had begun as a lightning invasion to secure a friendly regime had devolved into a costly, unending stalemate. The Red Army controlled the cities, airfields, and major highways, but beyond them stretched a vast, uncontrollable countryside dominated by the Mujahideen. Every convoy risked ambush, every patrol could vanish without a trace, and every mountain hid a potential sniper's nest. For the soldiers of the Soviet 40th Army, Afghanistan was no longer a campaign, it was a nightmare. They fought an invisible enemy that seemed to rise from the rocks themselves. Each victory was temporary, each village retaken by day, only to be lost again by night. Within Moscow, unease began to spread. The Soviet people, shielded for years from the full truth, started hearing whispers of mounting casualties. Mothers received sealed coffins with little explanation. Funerals were held quietly, without honors. Afghanistan, once touted as a mission of international solidarity, had become the empire's hidden wound. In March 1985, a new face appeared at the helm of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, the youngest leader in Kremlin history since Stalin. Charismatic, pragmatic, and painfully aware of his country's economic decay, Gorbachev sought reform under the banners of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. To him, Afghanistan represented everything wrong with the old system: secrecy, stagnation, and a refusal to face reality. He must find a way out, he reportedly told his advisors. We cannot stay there indefinitely. But even for a reformer, leaving Afghanistan was easier said than done. Withdrawal carried risks of humiliation, of losing influence, and of handing victory to the West. Still, Gorbachev began exploring diplomacy. Through back channels, the Soviets reached out to Pakistan and the United States, searching for a face-saving solution. But on the ground, the war continued to grind forward. Soviet generals, unwilling to concede failure, requested more troops, more aircraft, and harsher tactics. Gorbachev, caught between military pride and political necessity, approved limited offensives, even as he privately sought a path to exit. In the rugged mountains of Panjshir Valley, one man had become a symbol of Afghan defiance: Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir. A former engineering student turned guerrilla commander, Massoud had built an extraordinary resistance network that combined military strategy with political vision. Unlike many Mujahideen leaders, Massoud believed in unity, discipline, and governance. In territories under his control, he established schools, hospitals, and local councils. His fighters, drawn from Tajik and northern Afghan communities, respected him not only as a warrior, but as a leader of rare intellect and honor. Soviet commanders, launched 9 major offensives against the Panjshir between 1980 and 1985. Each time, they failed. Massoud used deception and deep knowledge of the terrain to outwit superior forces, retreating when necessary, striking when least expected. His resistance became legendary, his image broadcast by Western journalists as the face of the Afghan Jihad. For Moscow, the Panjshir became a symbol of frustration. For Washington, it became a symbol of hope, a reminder that the Soviet war machine could be resisted, even defeated, by courage and faith. By 1986, the Afghan resistance had evolved into one of the most heavily supported insurgencies in modern history. The CIA's Operation Cyclone expanded dramatically under the Reagan administration. Funding, once measured in tens of millions, now exceeded $600 million per year. In coordination with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, the U.S. began supplying the Mujahideen with increasingly sophisticated weaponry. The most revolutionary of these arrived quietly in late 1986, the FIM-92 Stinger missile, a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapon that would change the war's course. For years, Soviet air superiority had been decisive. Helicopter gunships, particularly the Mi-24 Hind, had terrorized villages and decimated resistance positions. The Stinger altered that balance overnight. Suddenly, Afghan fighters could target Soviet aircraft with deadly precision. In the first months alone, dozens of helicopters were shot down. Television footage of Mujahideen celebrating around the wreckage of burning Hinds electrified audiences in the West. For the Soviets, it was a psychological blow unlike any before. The skies, once theirs, were no longer safe. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia matched every American dollar spent, channeling vast sums through religious networks. Preachers across the Muslim world invoked the Afghan Jihad as a sacred duty. Thousands of volunteers, Egyptians, Algerians, Yemenis, and Saudis, poured into Pakistan to join the fight or fund it. Among them was Osama bin Laden, who began constructing roads, camps, and tunnels for Arab fighters near Khost and Jalalabad. What began as an Afghan struggle for independence was becoming a transnational jihad, one that would outlive the war itself. Facing the loss of control in key provinces, the Soviet army responded with ruthless ferocity. Entire regions were subjected to scorched earth campaigns. Villages suspected of aiding the Mujahideen were bombed into rubble, crops were burned, wells poisoned, and livestock slaughtered. One of the deadliest operations occurred in Kandahar province, where Soviet and Afghan government forces sought to crush the resistance through massive aerial bombardment. The offensive destroyed hundreds of villages and displaced tens of thousands. Yet, the insurgency always re-emerged, like a grass growing through ashes. To weaken the Mujahideen's base of support, the Soviets targeted civilians directly. Cluster bombs and butterfly mines, designed to maim rather than kill, were scattered by the millions. Fields became deadly traps, ensuring that Afghan peasants could neither farm nor flee without risking their lives. Inside the Red Army, morale collapsed. Many conscripts, poorly trained and demoralized, turned to drugs, alcohol, or desertion. Letters smuggled back to the Soviet Union painted a picture of despair. "We are fighting ghosts. Every hill hides death," one soldier wrote. By 1986, the Soviet casualty count had surpassed 40,000, with no victory in sight. While Soviet troops battled in the mountains, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, led first by Babrak Karmal and later by Mohammad Najibullah, faced its own crisis of legitimacy. The regime, sustained by Soviet firepower and financial aid, had little popular support. Its ideology of Marxist modernization clashed with Afghanistan's conservative traditions. In 1986, Gorbachev replaced Karmal with Dr. Najibullah, the former head of the secret police, hoping that his strength and charisma might stabilize the regime. Najibullah launched the National Reconciliation Policy, offering amnesty to insurgents and promises of power sharing. He sought to portray himself as a patriotic Afghan rather than a Soviet puppet. But the Mujahideen dismissed his overtures as propaganda. For them, reconciliation was impossible while Soviet troops remained on Afghan soil. Still, Najibullah's reforms, though limited, revealed Moscow's shifting strategy. It was no longer about winning outright, but about leaving behind a government that could somehow survive withdrawal. The mid-1980s marked the peak of human suffering in Afghanistan. By 1987, more than 5 million Afghans, nearly one-third of the population, lived as refugees, the largest displaced population on Earth. In the dusty camps of Pakistan and Iran, life revolved around aid rations, makeshift schools, and rumors from home. Inside Afghanistan, famine and disease spread through war-ravaged provinces. Entire generations grew up without education, without peace, without the memory of normal life. Journalists and aid workers who ventured into the war zone described a haunting landscape: ghost villages, cratered roads, burnt-out mosques. And yet, amid ruin, Afghan resilience shone. Poetry, faith, and community sustained a people whose suffering seemed endless. One aid worker recalled a child in a refugee camp reciting verses of hope scratched into the dust with a stick. The invader will leave, but the mountains will remain. As battlefield losses mounted, Gorbachev intensified diplomatic efforts. The United Nations, under mediator Diego Cordovez, convened indirect talks between Afghanistan and Pakistan with the U.S. and Soviet Union as guarantors. The negotiations focused on 4 principles: non-interference, troop withdrawal, refugee return, and international guarantees of neutrality. But progress was slow. Pakistan refused to recognize Najibullah's government, insisting that any settlement must include the Mujahideen. The Soviets, meanwhile, demanded guarantees that Afghanistan would not become a Western or Islamist outpost after their departure. In private, Soviet diplomats acknowledged what their generals would not: the war was unwinnable. "Each day we stay, we lose more than we can ever gain," one Foreign Ministry memo read. By late 1987, Gorbachev announced publicly that Soviet troops would begin withdrawal within a reasonable time frame. For the first time, the end of the war seemed conceivable. The battlefield momentum was shifting irreversibly. With the introduction of the Stinger missiles, Soviet helicopters and jets could no longer dominate the skies. Supply convoys, once escorted from above, now traveled with fear. Mujahideen units, emboldened by new technology and global backing, launched coordinated offensives in provinces once thought secure. In Host, Herat, and Jalalabad, Soviet garrisons faced relentless siege. Entire platoons were cut off, surviving only by air resupply. For the first time, Soviet officers began speaking openly of strategic withdrawal zones. Meanwhile, international media portrayed the Mujahideen not merely as rebels, but as victors in waiting. American politicians proudly brandished photos of Afghan fighters on Capitol Hill. The Reagan Doctrine, supporting anti-communist resistance movements worldwide, had found its most dramatic success story. But beneath the celebration lay a darker truth. The war's escalation had created new power centers among the Mujahideen, rival factions funded by competing foreign patrons, each dreaming not only of liberation, but of dominance in a post-Soviet Afghanistan. By 1987, even Soviet generals began to question the purpose of their mission. "We can seize ground, but we cannot hold the hearts of men," one commander admitted. Troops returning to Moscow brought back stories of futility and despair. Back home, the Soviet economy was collapsing under military strain. Bread lines lengthened, industries faltered, and Gorbachev's reforms met resistance from within. Afghanistan had become a metaphor for the Soviet Union itself, an empire overextended, bleeding from within. In Kabul, Najibullah clung to power with Soviet backing, but even he sensed the winds of change. He told his aides, "The world is shifting. We must prepare for the storm to come." As 1987 drew to a close, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Soviet Union, drained of blood and treasure, sought an exit that would preserve dignity, if not victory. The Mujahideen, confident but fragmented, awaited the moment when their occupiers would finally leave. From the frozen passes of the Hindu Kush to the refugee camps of Peshawar, a weary hope spread among Afghans. Perhaps the nightmare was nearing an end. Yet few saw what would follow. The coming withdrawal would not bring peace. It would open a new chapter of struggle, as the victors of the Jihad turned against one another in a fight for power, ideology, and identity. For now, however, in the fading light of 1987, one truth was undeniable. The tide had turned. The Soviet Empire was retreating from the mountains of Afghanistan, and history was preparing to turn its next blood-stained page. By early 1988, the war that had begun with promises of swift victory had become an open wound on the Soviet conscience. Nearly a decade of fighting had yielded nothing but shattered villages, devastated lives, and a generation of soldiers scarred by trauma and guilt. The question was no longer if the Red Army would leave Afghanistan, but how. Inside the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev had made up his mind. "We have paid in blood," he declared, "and we must end this tragedy." The decision to withdraw was both a strategic necessity and a political gamble. To the world, it would signal the end of Soviet expansionism. To the generals, it would mean admitting failure. To the Afghan regime in Kabul, it would be the beginning of an uncertain survival. The Soviet Union's exit strategy rested on the hope that the Najibullah government could stand on its own long enough to negotiate peace. But few in Moscow or Kabul believed it. The Afghan state was an edifice built on Soviet steel. When that support was gone, it would be tested as never before. In April 1988, after nearly 6 years of indirect negotiations mediated by the United Nations, the Geneva Accords were signed. The agreement involved 4 parties: Afghanistan, Pakistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The terms were clear. The Soviets would withdraw their troops within 9 months. Pakistan and the U.S. would cease aiding the Mujahideen. Afghanistan would refrain from interfering in its neighbors' affairs. But beneath the signatures, mistrust festered. Pakistan's military ruler, General Zia-ul-Haq, had no intention of cutting off support to the Mujahideen. For him, Afghanistan was a buffer zone and a strategic card in Pakistan's rivalry with India. The Americans, too, viewed the accords as a diplomatic formality rather than a binding endgame. The CIA's funding lines to the resistance remained open, and shipments of weapons, including the coveted Stinger missiles, continued to flow through the mountains. To the Mujahideen themselves, the Geneva Accords were meaningless. "No one spoke for us," said one commander bitterly. "We fight for God and for Afghanistan, not for the signatures of politicians." Thus, even as diplomats toasted in Geneva, the war continued unabated on Afghan soil. Before leaving, the Soviets sought one last display of strength, a final operation to prove that their withdrawal was voluntary, not a retreat. This became Operation Magistral, launched in late 1987 and continuing into early 1988. The target was the Khost province, where Mujahideen forces had surrounded the city, cutting it off for months. Soviet commanders saw it as a matter of honor to break the siege. Over 10,000 troops, backed by tanks, artillery, and helicopter gunships, advanced through rugged mountain passes. The operation achieved its tactical goal. The road to coast was reopened and supplies reached the besieged garrison. But strategically, it changed nothing. Within weeks, the Mujahideen reclaimed much of the territory. The victory was fleeting, a symbolic gesture of pride rather than progress. Still, Soviet propaganda declared it a triumph. Newspapers printed images of soldiers shaking hands, smiling beneath fluttering red flags. For the families of the fallen, it was hollow comfort. The reality was clear. The empire was leaving. On May 15, 1988, the first Soviet convoys began crossing the Amu Darya River back into Uzbekistan. The withdrawal, planned in stages, was to be completed by February 15, 1989, exactly 9 months later. Television cameras captured the scenes, armored columns moving slowly across icy roads, helicopters lifting off from dust-choked airfields, soldiers waving at the villagers who once feared them. Some moments were surprisingly human. Soviet officers exchanged quiet farewells with Afghan allies. Others wept openly over lost comrades, over wasted years. "We leave behind friends and graves, and we take home only memories of pain," one soldier told a reporter. Behind the cameras, chaos reigned. As Soviet units withdrew, Mujahideen groups moved in to fill the vacuum, clashing with government troops and with one another. Entire districts changed hands overnight. In Kabul, Najibullah watched anxiously. His government depended on Soviet supplies, fuel, and air support. Every departing convoy felt like the pulling of a lifeline. "Without them," one of his ministers whispered, "we will be naked before the storm." By late 1988, the Mujahideen's confidence was unmatched. They saw themselves as victors of a divine war, peasants and tribesmen who had humbled a superpower. Yet victory brought its own curse. The movement was deeply fragmented. Dozens of factions competed for dominance: Hezb-e-Islami under Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Jamiat-e-Islami under Ahmad Shah Massoud, Harakat, Ittihad, Hizb-e-Wadat, and others, each backed by different foreign patrons, each with rival visions for Afghanistan's future. In Peshawar, Pakistan, the leaders of these factions bickered over who would lead a post-war government. Hekmatyar, favored by the ISI, rejected any coalition that diluted his power. Massoud, admired by Western journalists and diplomats, sought unity and political transition. On the ground, their fighters often turned their guns on each other as much as on the Kabul regime. The dream of liberation was already giving way to a nightmare of division. To the surprise of nearly everyone, the Najibullah regime did not collapse immediately after the Soviet withdrawal. In fact, it endured far longer than Western analysts predicted. Najibullah, though reviled by the Mujahideen as a Soviet puppet, was a shrewd political survivor. He understood tribal politics and worked tirelessly to consolidate his power base. His national reconciliation policy, launched in 1987, continued after the Soviet departure, offering amnesty, cash, and even positions to local commanders willing to switch sides. At the same time, his government benefited from a crucial fact. The Soviet Union, though withdrawing troops, continued to send billions in economic aid and weapons. Soviet advisors remained in Kabul, maintaining the tanks, aircraft, and artillery that formed the backbone of Najibullah's defense. By 1989, Najibullah controlled most major cities, while the Mujahideen dominated the countryside. It was a fragile balance, but it kept the state alive, at least for a while. The first major test of the post-Soviet order came just weeks after the last Red Army soldier crossed the border. In March 1989, Mujahideen forces launched a massive assault on Jalalabad, a key city near the Pakistan frontier. The attack was intended as a swift victory, a symbolic capture that would pave the way for an advance on Kabul. Backed by Pakistani intelligence and supplied with American weapons, the Mujahideen assembled thousands of fighters. But Najibullah's army, supported by artillery and aircraft still operated by Soviet-trained crews, fought back fiercely. The siege dragged on for months, turning into a bloodbath. The Mujahideen suffered staggering losses, some estimates exceeding 10,000 dead. The Battle of Jalalabad shocked their supporters. It proved that the Kabul regime was not as fragile as believed. It also revealed the deep disunity among resistance factions, who failed to coordinate strategy. For Najibullah, it was a rare moment of triumph. He appeared on television in military uniform, declaring, "We are not the puppets of foreigners. We are Afghans defending our homeland." While Najibullah held his ground, events in Moscow took a dramatic turn. The Soviet Union itself was crumbling under the weight of reform and unrest. In 1991, amid failed coups and independence movements, the empire that had once spanned 11 time zones dissolved into 15 republics. For Afghanistan, this was the final blow. The new Russian Federation, under Boris Yeltsin, had no appetite for supporting Najibullah's regime. Financial aid dried up, ammunition shipments ceased, and spare parts for aircraft ran out. By early 1992, the Afghan army, once 300,000 strong, was collapsing. Entire divisions defected to Mujahideen commanders. Government officials fled abroad, taking whatever wealth they could carry. Najibullah, abandoned by his patrons, barricaded himself in the United Nations compound in Kabul, refusing to resign but unable to rule. The city teetered on the brink of chaos. In April 1992, after months of crumbling defenses, Kabul fell. But it was not one army that entered, it was many. Mujahideen factions swept into the capital from every direction, each claiming victory, each seeking control. Ahmad Shah Massoud's forces entered from the north. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's troops closed in from the south. Rival militias occupied ministries, arsenals, and airfields. What began as celebration quickly descended into chaos. For the people of Kabul, liberation turned to horror. Shells rained down as factions battled for power. The capital, once the jewel of Central Asia, became a ruin of burned neighborhoods and mass graves. Najibullah, denied safe passage by his enemies, remained trapped in the UN compound for 4 long years. His fate would be sealed later, when the Taliban captured Kabul in 1996 and executed him publicly, hanging his body in the streets. The Soviet withdrawal marked the end of one chapter in history, but the beginning of another, far more turbulent one. The Afghan War had not ended. It had merely changed shape. In Washington, officials celebrated the Soviet defeat as proof of the West's moral and strategic victory in the Cold War. "The bear has been driven from the mountains," one senator proclaimed, but few asked what would happen next in those same mountains. The networks built to fund and arm the Mujahideen, the camps, charities, and training centers did not simply vanish. Instead, they evolved. Veterans of the Jihad, trained in guerrilla warfare and emboldened by divine success, carried their experience into new conflicts, from Bosnia to Chechnya to the Middle East. And among them, figures like Osama bin Laden would interpret Afghanistan's victory not as a geopolitical event, but as a divine sign that a superpower could be defeated by faith alone. The seeds for future wars were already being sown. Afghanistan in the early 1990s was a land without peace. The Soviet occupiers were gone, but unity had not come. Civil war erupted among former allies. Kabul was shelled by Afghan artillery, not foreign planes. The human cost was immeasurable. More than 1 million Afghans had died since 1979. 5 million more remained refugees. Entire generations had grown up knowing only war. For the world, Afghanistan became yesterday's story. Foreign correspondents left, cameras turned elsewhere, and aid dried up. Yet for Afghans, the suffering continued. In the vacuum of power and hope, new movements would rise. Movements that promised order after chaos, purity after corruption. Among them, in the dusty seminaries of Kandahar, a group of students began organizing under the banner of the Taliban. When the last Soviet tank crossed the Amu Darya River in 1989, an era ended, but history did not rest. The Soviet Union's Afghan war became a mirror reflecting the limits of power, the arrogance of intervention, and the resilience of those who resist it. For Moscow, Afghanistan was its Vietnam, a costly, demoralizing quagmire that accelerated imperial collapse. For Washington, it was a victory laced with irony, for the weapons and fighters it once supported would later haunt the very world they sought to defend. And for Afghanistan itself, it was a tragedy of endurance. From the ashes of foreign occupation would rise another cycle of violence, another struggle for identity, another generation searching for peace. As the dust settled over the Hindu Kush, one could almost hear the echo of history whispering, "Empires may invade, but the mountains remember, and those who fight for their homeland never truly surrender." When the last Soviet convoy crossed the Friendship Bridge on February 15, 1989, an era ended, but peace did not begin. Afghanistan, a nation torn apart by a decade of war, was left in ruins. Cities were devastated, infrastructure destroyed, and millions of Afghans displaced across Pakistan and Iran. The Soviet withdrawal marked a military retreat, but not a political resolution. The communist government in Kabul, led by Mohammad Najibullah, clung to power with dwindling Soviet support as Mujahideen factions prepared to fight not foreign troops this time, but each other. For ordinary Afghans, the end of Soviet occupation did not mean an end to suffering. The countryside was littered with landmines, villages were ghostly shells of their former selves, and famine loomed in many regions. The humanitarian crisis deepened as millions of refugees hesitated to return home, uncertain of safety. The nation had become a battlefield for ideology, religion, and power. But now, without the superpower that had once dictated its course, chaos took root. In Moscow, the retreat was viewed as both a humiliation and a lesson. The Soviet Union had entered Afghanistan to protect its sphere of influence and promote socialism. It left in defeat, disillusioned, and economically weakened. The invasion had drained its treasury, demoralized its army, and exposed the flaws of its leadership. It accelerated the unraveling of the USSR itself, which would collapse just 2 years later. Internationally, the world hailed the withdrawal as a victory for Afghan resistance and Western strategy. But this apparent triumph masked a grim truth. Afghanistan had been shattered, its society militarized, and its people radicalized. The weapons and ideologies left behind would echo far beyond its borders. After the Soviet exit, the power vacuum in Afghanistan plunged the nation into a brutal civil war. Mujahideen factions, once united by a common enemy, turned against one another in a scramble for dominance. Kabul, once the cultural heart of the nation, became the epicenter of destruction. Neighborhoods were bombarded by rockets. Streets turned into battlegrounds, and thousands of civilians perished as rival commanders fought for control. The United States, having achieved its objective of bleeding the Soviet Union, largely disengaged. Pakistan, however, remained deeply involved, supporting factions aligned with its strategic interests, particularly in establishing influence over a future Afghan government. Saudi Arabia, too, continued to fund groups aligned with its ideological vision of Islam. Afghanistan thus became a geopolitical playground for regional powers seeking to shape its destiny. Amid this chaos, a new force began to emerge in the mid-1990s, the Taliban. Born from the religious seminaries of Pakistan and composed largely of young Pashtun students, the Taliban promised order justice, and Islamic purity after years of lawlessness. Initially welcomed by war-weary Afghans, the movement swiftly captured vast territories. By 1996, they had seized Kabul, executing former President Najibullah and imposing a harsh interpretation of Islamic law. Women were barred from education and work. Music, art, and free speech were crushed. Minorities, especially the Shia Hazara community, faced persecution. Afghanistan became an isolated theocracy, ruled by fear and ideology. Yet for some, the Taliban's control brought a semblance of stability after years of anarchy, a dark stability that came at a heavy cost. Internationally, the Taliban's rise alarmed many nations. Their harboring of extremist groups, including Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda, transformed Afghanistan once again into a focal point of global concern. The war that had started as a Cold War proxy now evolved into a new kind of conflict, one driven by religion, extremism, and global terrorism. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had consequences far beyond the nation's borders. It reshaped global politics, redefined superpower strategy, and birthed new forms of conflict that would shape the 21st century. For the United States and its allies, Afghanistan was initially seen as a triumph of containment. The strategy of arming the Mujahideen had worked. The Soviet Union was defeated without direct American involvement. Yet this victory carried unintended consequences. The very fighters trained and armed by the CIA and Pakistan's ISI became the nucleus of extremist movements that would later threaten the world. Among them was Osama bin Laden, who had arrived in Afghanistan during the 1980s as part of the Arab volunteer network supporting the Mujahideen. In the chaos that followed the Soviet withdrawal, bin Laden and his allies established al-Qaeda, an organization that sought to unite Muslims under a radical ideology and wage global jihad. The same roots, weapons, and networks built during the anti-Soviet resistance now fueled transnational terrorism. For Pakistan, the war deepened its involvement in Afghanistan's internal affairs and empowered its intelligence agencies. Refugee camps became recruitment centers, madrasas turned into ideological factories, and the border between the two countries blurred under the weight of militant movement. The Afghan Jihad had transformed Pakistan's society, politics, and security landscape, a transformation that still shapes the region today. For the Soviet Union, the invasion marked the beginning of its end. The economic strain, the loss of global prestige, and the demoralization of its military compounded internal dissent. Soviet veterans returned home disillusioned, often suffering from trauma, addiction, and neglect. Within 2 years of the withdrawal, the USSR disintegrated, a superpower undone by its own ambitions and the resilience of a small, war-torn nation.
No statistic can capture the full human cost of the Soviet-Afghan War. Nearly 1 million Afghans were killed and over 5 million displaced. Generations grew up knowing nothing but war. Entire communities vanished, their history erased under the rubble of bombed villages and shattered cities. The psychological wounds ran deep. Children who had witnessed death and destruction became adults with no memory of peace. Women bore the heaviest burdens, losing husbands, sons, and homes, while navigating refugee life in foreign lands. Many were left to rebuild their lives amid ruins, facing not only economic hardship, but the trauma of survival. Even for Soviet soldiers, the war left deep scars. The Afghan syndrome became the Soviet counterpart to America's Vietnam syndrome. Veterans, many of them young conscripts, returned broken and forgotten. The Soviet government, eager to move past its failures, offered little support. In both Afghanistan and the USSR, the war became a symbol of disillusionment, a reminder of how ideology and ambition can consume human lives. For internationally, the plight of Afghan refugees reshaped the demographics of South and Central Asia. Pakistan's border regions swelled with millions of displaced Afghans, altering local economies and social structures. Some of these refugees, radicalized by war and ideology, became part of the next generation of militants. Others struggled simply to survive. Historians often call the Soviet-Afghan War the Vietnam of the USSR, and the parallels are striking. Both wars were fought by superpowers against guerrilla forces deeply rooted in local culture and geography. Both involved attempts to impose political ideology on nations resistant to external control. And in both, the invaders underestimated the resilience of the local population and overestimated the legitimacy of their allies. For the Soviet Union, Afghanistan became a quagmire of moral and strategic failure. Each year of occupation deepened the divide between the state and its citizens. Propaganda at home portrayed the war as a noble struggle, but the growing number of body bags told a different story. The loss of young soldiers, coupled with economic strain, eroded public faith in the regime. The war became a wound that bled into every aspect of Soviet life: political, cultural, and psychological. When Mikhail Gorbachev finally decided to withdraw, he acknowledged what his predecessors could not: that victory was impossible. The cost had been too high, the purpose too lost, and the outcome too uncertain. Afghanistan had become a mirror reflecting the decay of the Soviet Empire. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was more than a Cold War episode. It was a turning point in modern history. It redefined the nature of warfare, reshaped global alliances, and sowed the seeds for conflicts that continue today. For Afghanistan, the war marked the beginning of a long descent into instability. The country that once stood at the crossroads of civilizations became synonymous with endless conflict. Every regime that followed, from the Mujahideen factions to the Taliban, inherited a legacy of violence, mistrust, and destruction. For the world, the lessons were complex. Superpowers learned that occupation breeds resistance, that ideology cannot conquer identity, and that proxy wars often create monsters of their own making. Yet amid the ruins, Afghanistan endured. Its people, resilient, proud, and unbroken, continued to rebuild, to hope, and to dream. The same mountains that had resisted empires for centuries stood witness to another truth: that no foreign power, no matter how mighty, can ever truly conquer the human spirit. As the dust of the Soviet withdrawal settled, few realized that Afghanistan's story was far from over. A new chapter, one that would draw the world back into its mountains and valleys, was about to begin. But that is another story. History doesn't just live in the past, it shapes the world we live in today. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan wasn't just a Cold War battle. It was a lesson in power, resistance, and the cost of ambition. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered and learned from, then help us keep history alive. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history's turning points.